Welcome. We're really excited to talk today about intermittent fasting. I'm Dr. Molly Force from Prosper Natural Health here, and I've got Dr. Rosalie and Dr. Mary who are joining us today. And we do a kind of a unique model here at Prosper. We have what we call team care. And what that means to us is that our patients get better access to clinicians when they need us. And we like the idea that many brains thinking about situations come up with better plans for people. So we love to be able to work with our patients and really bring in expertise from the traditional medical model as well as our beautiful naturopathic roots. And then we've also got expertise coming from Dr. Rosalie with Ayurvedic medicine, Eastern Indian medicine, and Dr. Mary with traditional Chinese medicine and acupuncture. So we feel like that can really help patients to round out their experience in the natural medical field. So what we're doing this year is a little different for DocTalks, and we're super excited you guys are joining us. What we've decided to do is take what we call clinical spotlights. So these are things that patients are asking us about a lot, topics that come up over and over, and we want them to be really relevant. One of the reasons we do these doc talks is to make sure that information can be shared and used by our patients and by you guys. And we want to make sure that we have time to answer questions today. So if they come up, make sure that you put them in the chat so we don't forget to answer those at the end. And we wanted to talk about intermittent fasting because it's just a really hot topic. Now, we've known about intermittent fasting in the scientific world for many, many years, and you're going to see some really cool documentation today that shows that there have been some phenomenal studies on intermittent fasting and how it can be really beneficial for a lot of people. So this is something that we see quite a bit advertised online right now, and especially with the new years, it seems like a lot of the algorithms in social media are really pushing the weight loss piece and, you know, the new year, new you, new health sort of piece. So we thought that talking about intermittent fasting here in January would be really apropos to everybody's needs. So one of the coolest things about intermittent fasting that we're going to talk about has to do with this idea that intermittent fasting is one of the few things that we can engage in which may end up helping longevity. And we're going to jump into all of that in the research today. So what intermittent fasting really is referring to is these periods of time where we're not having any caloric intake. So we usually are seeing this with intermittent fasting with these regular periods of time where we're not eating food. And this can be done in several different forms, and we're going to talk about those today and why somebody might choose one or the other. But commonly, we're thinking about this as coinciding with our diurnal cycle, which means our wake and our sleep cycle with the sun. So usually we're thinking about this fasting occurring for at least 12 hours, up to 16 hours, sometimes even longer, and that coinciding with our sleep. And we also want to just say with intermittent fasting, traditionally, it doesn't specify what foods can be eaten during that eating period. We also know that for intermittent fasting, and when we look at the studies, hydration is not limited. So that means that as long as it's not a calorically rich beverage, then it's allowed. So that means water, or even things like some of our fizzy waters that are flavored beverages, but they are non-caloric, they're 0 calories. That means that they're allowed during that fasting period. And then we have some different examples here. Sometimes people will, start right around 6 p.m. or 7 p.m. after dinner time, and they'll fast all the way till 10 a.m., for example, and that's considered a 16-hour fast. We're going to talk about fasting ratios. By the end, you guys are going to be experts here with this kind of stuff. But another way to do it would be, so we're having our food really between that like 10 a.m. all the way until 6 p.m. and not necessarily limiting ourselves to 2 or 3 meals during that time. Food intake when we're talking about intermittent fasting can actually happen throughout that time. Now, there may be some advantages or disadvantages to that, and we'll talk about different ways to structure that today. There are other types of intermittent fasting that sometimes we don't necessarily think about. There's something called time restricted feeding, and this is really eating within a specific window frame and really extending that overnight fast. And that's kind of what we were just talking about. But there's also alternate day fasting, and that's really where you're restricting the caloric intake every other day, and as much as the 20% of what it typically would be on your non-fasting days. Another way to structure fasting is a 5-2 intermittent fast. And that's where 5 days a week, normal eating happens, regular food intake, but 2 days a week, the caloric intake is drastically reduced up to, really reducing it down to about 500 calories a day. So there are different ways to structure intermittent fasting, and there's research showing that these ways can be very helpful. And one of the takeaways that we want you guys to walk away with today is that the difference between the time restricted feeding type of intermittent fasting, the one that's often promoted right now on social media, and the intermittent fasting that's a 5-2 where you're having 2 days where you're not eating, actually in the clinical literature, a lot of times we're seeing really wonderful benefits from either form. So one of the things that we know is restricted eating when it comes to doing these intermittent fast forms. It's the restriction of the calories that seem to be providing the benefit, not necessarily the ratio that's chosen of either the days or the hours necessarily. So, and we'll get into more details about that, but we just wanted to let you guys know that there are many different ways to structure these different fasts.
Thanks, Dr. Molly. So I'll take it from here. What's so amazing about intermittent fasting is we're not necessarily talking to you about what to eat, right? It's more so when to eat, which is just another layer of how to find optimal health ultimately. So with intermittent fasting, it gets a lot of hype when it comes to weight loss, but ultimately it's not all about weight loss. There's some forms of intermittent fasting where there is no weight loss, right? And patients are just kind of maintaining their healthy weight at their healthy state. There's a lot of literature out there that we dove into today, and we'll get into that next. But here's kind of an outline slide in regards to what are the benefits of intermittent fasting. And like Dr. Molly mentioned, it can improve longevity and lifespan, which is kind of a wild concept. There's really nothing else out there that we can kind of attribute to that piece. It also helps with mental clarity, especially with brain fog. Glycemic control, insulin resistance, which is basically helping with high blood sugar levels. Same thing with improving dyslipidemia, which is a state where you've got high blood fats or high cholesterol. Same thing with hypertension. There are some studies out there that show that intermittent fasting can diminish our blood pressure. In general, intermittent fasting can diminish systemic inflammation, whole body inflammation, and it also diminishes the risk of some chronic diseases such as diabetes, cancer, and cardiovascular disease. And then lastly, we'll talk about a study that showed it's being helpful as an adjunctive cancer care treatment. So here's the part of the Doc Talk where we dive into the literature and into the recent studies out there, which is something that's so exciting for us docs to kind of open up the old books and then look at the new stuff. But we just wanted to highlight a couple. So this is an intermittent fasting article on specifically related to weight loss and glycemic control, which means blood sugar regulation. And it's a systematic review, which means they looked at 41 articles out there, 41 studies on caloric restriction and intermittent fasting. And they did a review of what did these 41 studies, what were the conclusions? And so of those studies, 27 were intermittent fasting related, and they found weight loss in all of them from 0.8% to 13% from your baseline weight with no serious adverse events, which is pretty remarkable when it comes to a weight loss regimen. 12 of those studies found intermittent fasting compared to caloric restriction diets to be equivalent. That's sort of going back to the previous slide that Dr. Molly talked about in terms of different types of intermittent fasting. That's just what that's referring to. And then 5 studies looked at specifically patients with type 2 diabetes that showed that intermittent fasting actually helped with their glycemic control, which is pretty amazing. No insulin needed, right? So it's something to just think about in terms of weight loss and glycemic control. This next article or a research study from just last year also describes its benefits on weight loss, blood sugar, but also cholesterol regulation. So in this study, again, it was a meta-analysis, which is kind of the best kind of study, looking at all 43 randomized controlled trials of intermittent fasting. So this is kind of the data synthesized in a paragraph here. But intermittent fasting was seen to be more beneficial in reducing body weight, waist circumference, fat mass, without affecting lean mass as compared to a non-intervention diet, which means just a regular diet where we're not doing any intermittent fasts. Also effectively improved insulin resistance, which is something that we see in our prediabetes and type 2 diabetes patients, and as well as blood lipid conditions, which just means your blood cholesterol. So improvements there, which is pretty amazing.
Okay, so next we're going to dive into some research on mental clarity and cognitive performance. So this is a 2016 review article where they looked at all the research to date that has looked into the effects of intermittent fasting on mental clarity and cognitive performance. And they found that intermittent fasting with exercise improves brain plasticity. So that's a fancy word for the brain's ability to learn new things and make new connections. And that is huge. That can come into play over time when it comes to our brain health as we age. So we want our brain to keep plastic and keep developing new connections. And that's one of the ways that we are able to maintain memory over time. Interesting that they found it was the combination of intermittent fasting with exercise that was associated with this. So another thing to think about incorporating into a broader plan with intermittent fasting. They also found that intermittent fasting may improve memory over time. And this was thought to be due to a decreased inflammatory response in the brain. So there's certain cytokines that, those are inflammatory messengers in the brain that can lead to cognitive deficits, including memory deficits. And so they found that the intermittent fasting was kind of a break point for the cytokine expression and therefore may improve cognitive function over time by decreasing that inflammatory response. So, and then here we have some research on longevity, on the effects of intermittent fasting on our lifespan and our health over time. So, to date, there are no randomized controlled clinical trials on humans. As you can imagine, this is a pretty long endpoint to study, but they have seen in animal models, including studies on mice, fruit flies, and non-primates, that they've seen that these animals that are eating at restricted time periods have had longer lifespans and health spans. There's a lot of research on fruit flies and longevity, which is, it's helpful that they live for such a short period of time. And they found that one really interesting thing was that they only had improvement with nighttime feeding restriction, not daytime feeding. So similar to the kind of restricted feeding of, nighttime fasting. And the authors hypothesize that this is because of an improved circadian rhythm with this intermittent fasting. So this is, there's a fancy term called circadian regulated autophagy, where our brains are actually able to kind of clean up extra proteins and garbage, if you will, that accumulates in our brain and nervous tissue. And so at night when we're sleeping, there's this really important process whereby our lymphatic system is cleaning up that extra debris, and that is highly related to improved cognitive function. So that's an interesting connection here, and it's worth considering the regimens where you're having nighttime fasting for that endpoint.
So you guys probably know that cardiovascular disease is one of the biggest killers in the US. It's a major issue for us as far as chronic illness goes. And so this is some of the research that we were able to pull, specifically talking about cardiovascular health and how it can benefit from this intermittent fasting. And we know that, these research articles might be a little bit dry to some people. We get really excited about them. And being kind of nerdy doctors, but we wanted to make sure you guys had these so you could refer back to them. And if you wanted to dig in a little bit more, that you had a really good starting place, because these are some of the original research articles or the meta-analyses that will allow you to go back into some of this, what we call primary literature. So in this one, what was so cool is that they were able to look at these different health markers for cardiovascular outcomes. So that's obesity, hypertension, so high blood pressure, and dyslipidemia, which is that high cholesterol or high triglycerides. And then they looked at diabetes as well. And they were able to find that benefits within each of those categories. And then these authors were suggesting that another mechanism, which is this mechanism of inducing the antioxidant system, so the system that helps us clean up, not through autophagy, but by helping our oxidative stress be reduced, doing that as well as syncing with that circadian system and inducing some form of ketogenesis is what's going to be beneficial for that cardiovascular system. Now, when we think about longevity, we're thinking about some of the big killers like cardiovascular disease. Cancer comes up as well. So we pulled some studies on cancer. This one was kind of a neat one because it's a review of many different primary literature articles. And so this was a more of a composite study where they were looking at this review, and they were saying that, in many different types of cancer processes, we see an improvement with intermittent fasting. And the real kicker here for us is that they showed that extended periodic fasting or intermittent fasting alone without adjunctive treatment seems to be helpful. So that's pretty amazing that it is such a powerful option for inducing certain cellular immunity. We also were able to find some interesting articles specifically about COVID. And of course, this is still very relevant for many of us with the pandemic, that we just are all in the midst of experiencing. So this was one of the original articles that came out. You can see it's October 2020, and then there have been several meta-analyses since then. And what they're doing is they were saying, hey, folks who engage in intermittent fasting actually are seeing a benefit clinically in how they're getting through this virus. Now, once again, we're going to use that fancy phrase, that fancy word that Dr. Mary brought up of autophagies, because that's what these researchers were really finding, is that this intermittent fasting really promotes, it activates this autophagy that happens. And this time we're seeing it happen in the immune system in regards to viruses and viral reactions. So that helps us as, strengthening us as hosts against these infections. So pretty cool information there. Now, Dr. Rosalie is going to talk about these hypotheses of how intermittent fasting works.
Thanks, Dr. Molly. So this is kind of the cincher slide where we sort of talked through the benefits and gave you some data, but this is kind of the biochemistry behind all of that data, what the scientists think in terms of why does this work on so many levels for so many patients, for so many different acute and chronic diseases, right? And it has to do with 3 hypotheses, right? And so they're still studying whether this is truth, 100% truth, but they're 3 very compelling hypotheses. The first one being the oxidative stress hypothesis, which has to do with this idea that oxidative stress over time leads to inflammation systemically and can lead to sort of degenerative processes and chronic illness. And the oxidative stress hypothesis means that when we're taking a break from feeding, that's, something over 12 hours, ideally closer to a 16-hour fast, the body can sort of rest from the stressors of us constantly feeding it. So the GI tract can rest, the body can sort of clean up and prepare for the next feeding state. That means the mitochondria, our energy producers, our energy producing cells, can sort of also take a little breather and diminish their stress, meaning that they're ready to go to help with more energy when they're needed again. And this ultimately decreases what's known as free radical production, which is just another term for oxidative stress, something that leads to inflammation throughout the body. Hence, as you can see in the bottom left here, the thought here is that it produces less inflammation overall. So that's one branch of the three hypotheses in terms of intermittent fasting. The second one has to do with circadian rhythm, and this is one that is really compelling to me because there's research out there that does studies on sleep in terms of optimal sleep, and if when patients are sleeping in the depth of the night. And there's similar studies that comes to feeding, and when patients are feeding in the brightness of the day, right? And so ultimately, when we're pairing those two and we're sort of feeding when it's bright out and sleeping when it's dark out, we've sort of put our bodies in sync and have optimized our circadian rhythm. And that means ultimately that's when the organs are doing their best job. And so the liver, the pancreas, the adipose fat tissue, and the muscle cells are all working at their best, which thus optimize our energy and our food metabolism in general. That's the second hypothesis. The third one has to do with ketosis. And maybe you've heard of this when we've talked in the past about ketogenic diets, for example. And ketosis has to do with when the body is in a fasting state, right? There's no sugar coming in, being ingested. It has to pull from its fat stores and make sugar from the fat. Okay. And so when the body is in ketosis, it sort of has to switch into this different mode, this fat burning mode, in order to make energy. Ketogenesis is just the fancy term that describes the liver doing that process, which leads to diminished LDL, which is our bad cholesterol, and increased HDL, which is our good cholesterol. So when it comes to cholesterol regulation, this is a pretty compelling hypothesis in terms of helping with fat burning and reducing adipose tissue overall.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Rosalie. That was fascinating. I love breaking that down. So interesting. So next, we're going to talk about some of the downsides of intermittent fasting. As you can imagine, there are things to look out for and be aware of, and then there are strategies to meet these obstacles with. So in the fasting state, when we're having this period of not eating, you'll often notice just this kind of increased stomach grumbling, especially in the beginning. You'll feel more hungry. In some people, we'll see an increase in cortisol, which is a stress hormone, and an uptick in anxiety. In some folks, we'll see fatigue and lethargy. This is a sign that the body is adapting to the energy levels that it does have, or the energy sources that it does have in the fasting state. And this is often a kind of short-lived period for many people. And then we also will see irritability when and the feeling of being hangry before that feeding in the morning. Different people are constitutionally going to experience these in different ways. So, each of us has, some of us will have higher metabolism rates and are going to be more prone to that hangry feeling and the increased anxiety. So it's really important to listen to your body and talk to your healthcare practitioner about what you're experiencing so that they can troubleshoot it with you and, start with different feeding and fasting ratios that are going to work for you. And we'll discuss more on that in a few slides. In the feeding state, we'll often see overeating or binge eating once you are able to eat. And that's another thing to just be aware of. Think about having a regular meal and then taking some time to digest and allow yourself to feel sated before keeping eating, because likely you will still feel sated with the same amount of food that you normally eat. So some other things to consider are starting slow. So often we'll consider starting with a 12-12 ratio, or 12 hours of fasting and 12 hours of feeding. That's kind of the gentle entry into intermittent fasting. and then kind of progress on to other ratios that with a longer fasting period as your body metabolically kind of catches up. Think about, not eating when you're not hungry. So if you get to the time where it's time to have a meal and you realize, oh, I'm not actually hungry now, then you don't have to eat at that time. You can, extend the fast longer and wait until you are hungry. And then lastly, we want you to find the ideal ratio, as I was mentioning before. And this is such an individualized process for each person. So it's really important to reach out to your provider and have that in-depth conversation about what's going to work for you.
So this question of, is it right for me, is, of course, like Dr. Mary was saying, very individualized. So of course, we want to check in with our healthcare providers about that. And, if you guys have questions, we're here to help you with this kind of thing. It's what we do and what we love to help patients with. So there are all these benefits, and we know that there's all these benefits, but there are some folks that really should not be doing intermittent fasting. And so we want to talk to you guys about that, just to kind of lay out that groundwork too. We saw some of the, side effects that can happen, especially those first few weeks when the body is adapting and, getting hangry or irritable and having those lower blood sugar drops because the body hasn't adapted to its new feeding schedule. So the folks that really should, put the brakes on and not probably be doing things like intermittent fasting are, first of all, are type 1 diabetics. So these folks are dependent on insulin for their survival, and it can be very, very damaging to their organs very quickly if their blood sugar is becoming irregular. So that's something that would have to be handled with it would have to be monitored very closely and make sure that their insulin was dialed in if they were doing these fasting schedules. It's generally not appropriate for them. We also know that our patients with history of disordered eating, this can be very triggering for them, especially our anorexia or our binge eating patients. And that's kind of what we were alluding to on our last slide with Dr. Mary, explaining that sometimes there's that tendency to want to overeat or purge when we are allowed to eat, especially as we're initiating on to this, that idea of, okay, now it's safe for me to eat and now it's not safe for me to eat, can create some disordered patterns for some folks. So we want to be really clear about being really cautious. And if that's something you feel like you're dealing with, please reach out. As far as our pediatric patients, this is generally not appropriate for our pediatric patients. And that's just because they are growing so much and they need so much nutritionally. We generally are not wanting to restrict their food intake. Our pregnant and breastfeeding folks are also going to really not be good candidates for intermittent fasting. It's amazing what the body requires while building another human. And so we don't want to be restricting calories from those folks. Now, patients who have medications, pharmaceuticals in particular, that require food intake, and they're essential pharmaceuticals that are required for certain times of the day taken with food. This is another reason why intermittent fasting might not be completely appropriate for them, or they might have to make some modifications, and they'll really want to work with their health provider with that. And then, of course, our folks that are dealing with certain illnesses, folks that are dealing with athletic needs, like needing high intake of food because they're athletes, they might not be good candidates for intermittent fasting. You'll see here that we listed under the illnesses, potentially cancer, there are certain times where it may not be appropriate to restrict calorically. So it does become very individual. And same thing with folks that are more frail or elderly that already are pretty low BMI. That would be something we'd want to talk about and make sure, that we're not going to be engaging in too much weight loss, that kind of thing.
So if you are interested in starting intermittent fasting and you're excited about the benefits and you don't have any of the aforementioned conditions, then your next question here is, how do I start, right? And so ultimately, this ends up being a conversation I have with a lot of patients, is just let's assess where your feeding window is currently. So I put a example here. If your nighttime snack is at 9 p.m., or essentially your last sip of wine, that's a caloric intake, and that's about when you end for your feeding window. Then you sleep overnight, your first bite of breakfast or your latte is at 7 a.m. That means ultimately you've had a 10-hour fast, meaning that you have then a 14-hour feeding window, right? So your ratio would be 10 to 14, okay? And so once you've assessed what your feeding and fasting ratio is, you can start to make your feeding window a little bit shorter, bit by bit. Maybe it's a half hour on each end. Maybe it's a full 2 hours on each end. If you wake up and you're really not hungry, then I would say let's skip breakfast altogether or move it until 11 a.m., right? And so that's where you get to kind of have it, start thinking about how to make your feeding window shorter. Omitting that nighttime snack, or oftentimes for some people it's a nighttime caloric beverage, could also be really helpful to get you into the intermittent fasting state. Taking it slow is really important, especially in the beginning, and especially if you're someone who's really used to snacking throughout the day, right? Drastic caloric restriction can lead to hypoglycemia, which is low blood sugar levels. And you would have symptoms like a fast heartbeat, shaking, sweating, nervousness, maybe even brain fog and dizziness, right? We don't want to get you there. We want to take it slow. If that's sort of what's happening for you, then we've got to sort of extend your feeding period, so your body's not quite ready for such a drastic fast. And then aiming for a consistent fasting feeding ratio is very much individualized. And our next slide, we'll talk about this a bit further. So many folks will start at a 12-12 ratio, which means a 12-hour overnight fast and a 12-hour feeding period. So that's great. If you're there, you're there. Let's see how we can get you to a 14-10 ratio, where your overnight fast is 14 hours and your feeding is 10 hours. And so on and so on. A 16-8 is possible, and a 19-5 as well for some patients. Same thing here with the 5-2 ratio, which has to do with 5 days of normal eating that isn't time delayed. And then 2 days of caloric restriction. It doesn't have to be Saturday, Sunday, but it could be a Monday, Friday caloric restriction. That would also fit in the 5-2 day ratio. This is very much an individualized conversation that's helpful to have with your healthcare provider, because not everyone is able to do a 19-5, nor is it appropriate for everyone. And then some folks can really, really benefit from a 12-12, right? So this is where having a conversation with yourself, with your caloric needs, with what's going on around you, and your healthcare provider can sort of help guide you to your ideal ratio.
All right, so when we're getting started, if you have any kind of questions about, or it's common to have questions about, your blood sugar status, your blood sugar regulation, and, getting started, you want to make sure you don't have any underlying conditions that would make intermittent fasting contraindicated, it can be really helpful to get going with a basic panel to get a sense of where you are at physiologically before getting started. And then it's always really nice to see numbers. So you can do a baseline before starting an intermittent fasting journey, and then do another round a couple of months later and see where where that's taking you. So we have some really great discounted blood work panels at Prosper that are really useful as some kind of getting started for a number of the reasons that people use intermittent fasting. So we've got the Prosper Basic Wellness Panel that looks at everything that we want to see as naturopathic doctors on an annual basis, so that everything from your thyroid function to blood sugar to vitamin D. We have kind of hand-selected everything that we want to see. And so I love running that about once a year with my patients. Then we've also got a weight support panel. So this really delves into a number of markers that are important to look at if you're struggling to, if you're kind of coming up against a roadblock with weight loss. You just can't lose those few extra pounds and it's distressing. You can look at some of these markers like adiponectin, insulin, and leptin that'll tell you more information about where to go next. And then lastly, we have the comprehensive heart panel. So for folks with high blood lipids or hypertension, or which is also known as high blood pressure, or any history of cardiovascular disease, this is a really great panel to investigate your risk factors and to identify a path forward for healing cardiovascular disease. So again, really great things to think about before intermittent fasting for any of these endpoints that we have been discussing, like weight loss, blood sugar regulation, and cardiovascular disease.
One of the cool things that I really like about that specific cardiovascular panel is it does a fractionated lipids, which means instead of just looking at your total cholesterol and your HDL and LDL, it tells us how dense or buoyant those HDL and LDL are. So it's really cool to look at before people do intermittent fasting and after they've engaged in intermittent fasting, because the buoyancy and the density of their lipids change. And those are way more important and accurate for us in regards to what your actual cardiovascular risk is, rather than just the HDL and LDL and the total cholesterol. So it really gives us a good window into how much improvement we've seen over a span of time. And then these also add a few of these different panels have this, actually all three, I think, have sorry, I'm looking at C-reactive protein. So the weight support and the cardiovascular support look at the C-reactive protein, and that cardiovascular support helps us with looking at another antioxidant level with the homocysteine as well. So that kind of, remember when we were talking about those three different ways that intermittent fasting works and thinking about oxidation, that's a cool way to look at that. So another lab that we'll use sometimes in our practice is this micronutrient panel that's put out by SpectraCell. This is a specialty lab. And what's neat about that is we can get a really good understanding of what people's vitamin, mineral, and antioxidant levels are. And it's a nice thing to look at before and after. And especially if you're worried about certain deficiencies or an excess amount of these oxidative factors that we know can be damaging to cells and increase our inflammation and chronic disease, it's a neat starting place for our patients. And that's blood work.
So when it comes to breaking your fast or being successful in an intermittent fast regimen, we talk a lot about the macros in our visits with patients, and this has to do predominantly with protein and making sure you're getting enough protein towards the end of the day, your last meal, and that first meal that breaks your fast. Some examples of good healthy protein sources include bone broth made with beef, chicken, pork, lamb, fish even. It's liquid, it's easy to digest, but it has that essential macro that's going to help sustain you throughout the day. Balanced meals are also going to be quite important in terms of success when it comes to intermittent fasting. And that has to do with the fact that if you're breaking your fast with a donut, it's going to spike your blood sugar, and you definitely won't feel very well. And so a balanced meal would include a good amount of protein and some also full of healthy fats that are well tolerated, not in addition to probably a little bit of some carbohydrates. And so our healthy fats are our olive oil, our coconut, avocado oil, or even just straight avocado, nuts, seeds, olives, salmon, sardines, and especially our organic grass-fed dairy if you are someone who tolerates dairy well. That's definitely an individualized recommendation.
So a couple of other things that you might want to consider when getting started. So we've got a couple of things you can bring in as kind of to help you out. If you're someone who is a sweets person, and especially crave nighttime sweets, and that's your Achilles heel when it comes to fasting, something like gymnema, it's always so hard to pronounce, is a really good idea for you. And this is an Ayurvedic herb that helps curb sweet cravings. So you actually take it on your tongue, and it's wild. Chocolate will kind of taste like cardboard, and you won't taste the sweet. And it's just a way of kind of cutting that habit of eating too many sweets if you just don't enjoy it as much. So one thing to consider. You may want to bring on board a collagen powder. They're really helpful for maintaining your intestinal health and providing a bit of nutrition, and kind of helping you feel full. It really helps with satiety. And then lastly, you may want to consider MediClear protein powder. This has a wide array of vitamins and minerals. It's kind of one of the most complete products out on the market, and it's really great to add into your food to make sure that you're getting all of the micronutrients that will also keep you feeling fed. So, the more nutrient dense our food is when we are eating, the less hangry and kind of fatigued we'll feel, and when we're in the fasting state.
So before we jump into questions, we wanted to make sure that we have invited you guys to our next little chat, our doc talk, that's going to be a clinical spotlight on boosting libido naturally. And we're going to really be looking at some cool clinical research on herbal aphrodisiacs that are out there. And it happens to be on Valentine's Day. So that's why we're going with a fun topic here, boosting libido. So we want to make sure you guys put that on your calendars if it sounds like it'd be of interest to you. And let's take some questions if we have any. You guys are welcome to put them in. And if not, please know that you can give us a call or jump on our website to request an appointment, and we're happy to chat with you about what your specific goals are. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions, which is great, but we'll give people. Oh, good.
So This is from Colleen, and she was saying, I didn't hear how often intermittent fast should be happening all the time, once a month, or how often?
Really good question. So what I've gathered from the literature and just from working with patients for years, and I think that Dr. Mary and Dr. Rosalie will chorus in here with the same sort of answer, is that consistency does make a difference. So the intermittent fasting that you choose should be set up to be either a daily ratio sort of thing where it's broken into hours, or something like that, 5 days of eating, 2 days of restricted calories. So the research does show that consistency with this makes a big difference. And what we know from how the body works is we don't want to be doing erratic dietary habits as far as calorie intake. So having somebody do intermittent fasting one day and then have a really long period of eating the next day and then going back to restricted, you're going to have a lot of side effects from not having your blood sugar balanced, and a lot bigger risk of becoming hypoglycemic. And then that's where that cortisol production really can kick in, and the body sees it as a stress. So we want the body to be rhythmed, just like our sleep cycle and wake cycle is on a rhythm. You guys agree, docs?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We have another question here, which is there a caloric number that does not interrupt the fasting autophage process, i.e. a splash of milk in the morning with tea or coffee?
I can take this one. So when it comes to intermittent fasting, the ideal is, it has to do with when you take in calories, it is going to stimulate your insulin. And the two types of macronutrients that stimulates insulin release are protein and sugar. Okay, and fat does not. So when it comes to breaking your fast, your protein and sugar sources would indeed actively break your fast, take you out of ketogenesis. But something like pure fat would not, right? So that's maybe where you've heard in popular culture this concept of bulletproof coffee, right? So it's just coffee with some coconut cream or coconut fat or ghee in it instead of your cream or milk or teaspoon of sugar, right? So if you get something, if you need your morning coffee and you can't have it black, that's where you could consider adding a fat to it, but make sure there's no carbs or protein in that addition, if you indeed want to be actively continuing your fasting state.
So to expand on that even more, the splash of milk, especially if it's a non-fat or 1 or 2% milk, is going to be higher in carbohydrates. Okay, so that's going to push you out of ketosis, whereas a whole fat milk would be a little bit better, but it's still going to have some of those carbohydrates. And that's why we see, like Dr. Rosalie was talking about, people choosing a fat only, a grass-fed butter, MCT oil, coconut oil, ghee, those kind of things. And I've found with my patients that emulsifying those in your morning beverage, whether it be coffee or tea or matcha, if you have a little immersion blender, use a stick blender for that. It actually does cream the beverage phenomenally well. I was shocked the first few times I did it with just coconut oil. I thought, how can this become creamy and delicious? But it's actually doable. Any other questions here?
I don't see any more in the chat.
We had one question come up about protein, and I'm hoping I did a good job of answering it. And it was basically, is there a certain timing for protein? So just to reiterate on that, really making sure that that protein is kind of capping off your fast and starting that eating process in the morning can make a big difference for blood sugar stabilization. And especially in the beginning when we're getting into this, that can make a big difference. So highly recommend that. All right. Well, thank you guys so much. We look forward to seeing you next month, and we hope you have a great start to your New Year's. And this recording is going to be completely available online, and we'll send you out an email, and then it'll be posted to our website too. We also have a whole library of our prior DocTalks. So we've gone into depth quite a bit about blood sugar regulation and stress management and those kind of things, which might be really helpful to pair if you're thinking about doing the intermittent fasting piece. So feel free to access those recordings at your leisure. Right. Take care. Thank you.